Hey everyone, and welcome back to The Liquid Future. Today we're honored to have Jon Barnes as our guest. Jon Barnes is an author, thinker, democratic theorist, and applying democracy in companies as well. He has a broad range of work. I want to start by reading an excerpt from one of his books because it really struck me. Jon wrote, "Scientifically, you can describe the world as chaotic, but the system that governs us is based on linear logic. Democracy in the Western world certainly hasn't changed for 300 years really, but in the last 25, since the internet was invented, it's not changed at all. It's exactly the same as it was. You have a world that is scientifically chaotic against a system that is linear. That's what in engineering they call the Law of Requisite Variety. A system that governs another system has to have at least the variety of the system it's governing." And there's something about this quote that really lays out the problem. It's just that the world has changed so much, and yet our government systems are still based in this old logic. And I think, Jon, you speak to this better than almost anyone. So thank you for everything you've been writing, and thanks for joining us today to talk deeper about this.
Thanks, man. Happy to be here. Fun to chat.
Where do you start? How do you first bring to someone's attention what the problem is?
I mean, the way I first really sort of came to it, which is like Trump or Brexit. If you give people a practical example, it tends to be quite clear, or at least they feel in through their real experience rather than just intellectually that things are like not quite right. So that's kind of the entry point that I go for me. Brexit's a particularly interesting one because where you might have been a Democrat or a Republican in the past, with Brexit, it'll be far more nuanced or across parties whether you were in or out in the first place, and therefore there's like less legacy there. But basically you find that it's a totally polarizing question. It's almost an aggressive question, actually. Are you in or are you out? It's like imagine if you were asking that personally to someone, it would feel quite an attack almost. So to do that to a whole country turns out is just as equally divisive. And so I kind of bring it from that point of view, but the main point I have is that it's just a stupid question, essentially. It's far too simplistic to say you're in or out, because the implications are so systemic and so wild that I don't know if you've been following in the UK, but you just need to follow the news around it to see that no one knew what the implications were in the first place. So it's quite easily just from that simple entry point to show that the system that's governing the system has nowhere near the variety as the system that it's governing. Because of binary questions like in or out, basically. So yeah, I think that's the entry point for me.
And what would be a better way to do it? What does the alternative look like?
Well, I mean, I want to be careful not to just give this is the solution, because the solution is something that needs testing many times over time. And in fact should be constantly being tested. I guess the main thing I'm against is that the system that we currently have hasn't evolved, and things not evolving simply isn't intelligent fundamentally. Something that's intelligent evolves over time, and the fact that the version of democracy we have hasn't evolved isn't intelligent. So the alternative is something that evolves on its most basic level. Now, I'm always cautious nowadays in the past, the rhetoric I've brought is that democracy is broken. I do think that's true on many, many levels, but it's important to also realize that democracy has got us really far in a really short period of time. So if you were to ask people when did democracy reach mass adoption? As in, like, when was most of the world run democratically? Most people would give you answers in the order of hundreds of years, but I think it's about 20, perhaps max, that we've had 50% of the world governed quote unquote democratically. The last 20 years, I believe. I think it might have been in 09 or something like that. But before that, the world was predominantly autocratic, or they call them anocracies, which are like kind of blends of democracy and autocracy. So democracy is a really new thing. And in that period of time, if you look at the last 100 years, I think we've got 90 more countries that we had than we had. So the world is like insanely different. And the graph of democracy being adopted, let's call it a technology, being adopted more and more over the last 100 years, maps on perfectly with war decreasing over that time. So democracy is an incredible peacekeeper. And therefore the conclusion I come to is it's got us really far. But it's been in beta testing mode fundamentally. And now we need to like start upgrading that, you know. When you have an app, you receive bug fixes to it on a regular basis, and we need bug fixes for the version of democracy that we're running. And what's become very clear is that choosing this or that isn't that clever. Choosing for teams plays to parts of our mind that aren't necessarily the most rational, because we start playing identity politics, and like then misinformation can spread, etc., etc. So I think we need to see that democracy, the result, I guess, the solution, which I think what you were asking me originally, is that it needs to be something that evolves, and it's stopped evolving. And for me, it'll need to be something that evolves towards genuinely understanding what people want, given the right information that they've received, and that's very far from being the case at the moment, you know.
Yeah, so I want to dig into that a little deeper. You have this excellent TED Talk. You do a really great job in it. You start with this evocative story with your talking about your grandmother. I think that's one of the most really poignant examples to bring in how much the world has changed and really personalize the story, but identify that our systems of governance are really stagnant. So kudos to you for that. But then in the second half of your talk, you're going into talking about solutions, and you make this statement: we need to begin by figuring out what is the will of the people. And you're just alluding to this again. You need to figure out what people really want. And so I do want to dig into a little deeper. How do we do that? What does it even mean to know what people really want? Not necessarily in a philosophical sense, just in a logistical sense. How would we go about figuring out what people really want without asking them the reductionist question of are you in or are you out?
Right, and I guess without asking the like, I can't remember the old Henry Ford quote, you know, if I'd asked them what they wanted, they'd have said a faster horse, kind of thing. Which I guess actually doesn't apply here, because it's not like politicians have some great vision of the future, like the car in that metaphor. You know, there's a total absence of vision in politics, so it's not, in a way, actually that kind of doesn't apply. But I guess, I don't know, fundamentally I think that asking people what they want, when you say logistically, do you mean literally in terms of the mechanics of the democracy that does that?
Well, let's say you had an unlimited budget. What would the interface from, not necessarily digital, but just what are the individual citizens interacting with? How do I as an individual express to this democratic mechanism what I individually want, and how does that feed into the larger question of what does everyone want? What is this abstract concept of the people's will?
Right. Well, I mean, so let me take this from a couple of angles. Firstly is I think it needs to start locally far more than it does. So maybe that's the second principle. If the first one I gave earlier is that this needs to be something that evolves, the second one is that it needs to come from it needs to be an emergent phenomena. So a top-down one being to ask a whole country this or that is a fundamentally dangerous question. It would be like saying, give me all of your wealth and do you want me to put it on red or black? And that wouldn't be clever. What you'd probably do is you'd split your bet down across a load of different smaller bets, and you'd benefit from resilience by doing that. So I think that that's a key principle, and the way to do it that I can see best logistically, like you say, is probably to start at more local levels. So Switzerland, I think, is Nassim Taleb speaks well to this in Anti-Fragile about how Switzerland, perhaps one of the reasons it's so resilient economically, other than having many banks and expensive watches, is also that they make a lot more decisions at the local level. So there's a famous example of the heroin epidemic in Switzerland being counteracted by them finding really innovative local solutions, and then when it worked locally, so I think the solution was to give methadone and therapy over the counter, and so it put all the drug dealers out of business. And then because that worked, they copy and pasted that piece of code, let's say, across the other cantons, and so that phenomenon is able to scale. Like the good meme spreads in that instance. But it would be an utterly crazy concept to do that for a whole country. So just like suddenly we vote and the whole country decides that the whole country is going to get methadone over the counter for free. That would just be that would be a lunatic solution to solving heroin in a country. But piloting it at a local level gets you to check whether it's working or not. So logistically, I think that is one of the key things. It also allows for diversity. Not all areas of a country are the same, which is quite clear. I mean, you're from the US, it's even more clear. So I think that's perhaps a second principle. If the first one was evolving, the second one's probably that things need to be more emergent, and a top-down catch-all is not the way to do that fundamentally.
Okay, and so what is the role of a leader in a healthier democracy? Because I think, I mean, I'm not an expert on Brexit, but my understanding was that the question originally got put to the voters almost as like a bluff, so to speak. Was it David Cameron was like, he didn't expect it to pass, and he was trying to prove a point, right? And so then after the vote did go in the direction of leave, to what extent, the details aren't really fleshed out exactly as we've been talking about. It's a extremely simple question. To what extent are the elected leaders then bound to the specifics, versus to what extent can questions like that be used more as advisory? And right. So it seems like there's a real failure in listening, I'd say, almost more than anything else.
Yeah, so the 3 points that brings up in my mind, the first one's a question of leadership, the second one's about good questions, and the third one's about a culture of listening. So leadership, first of all, I just don't particularly see, if I think of David Cameron or Theresa May or whoever, I don't particularly see them as leaders other than bureaucrats, fundamentally. A leader being someone who somehow shares a vision of the future that is inspiring and interesting, and makes me and a whole group of people want to follow them towards that flag that they've planted. The only vision I can see that's there is the desire to be elected. So it's a self-interested vision fundamentally. It's certainly not a democratic one. So that sort of leadership, I personally just don't think is interesting in the future. I see the role of a bureaucrat in the future to be the role of a facilitator, whose job it is to be an amazing listener. The job of a facilitator is to help a group decide in small groups, and now we have technology to help groups decide in far larger groups. As we've seen, I think Taiwan is probably the best example, where they merge in-person facilitation as well as using an AI for large mass facilitation fundamentally. And then the second role of a leader is exactly the one that I shared first, which is that you share an inspiring vision from the future. And that's just not coming from politics. And that happens all the time. If you're you'll be inspired by some leader in the environmental movement that will make you want to run that way. By sharing their vision, and those ideas will still catch. Ideas spread in cultures so fast that I think that's what leadership can't end to that degree. So that's what leadership looks like in the future. The question of questions is a really interesting one, because like a whole conversation comes or doesn't come from the question that's asked. So if I do quite a lot of group facilitation. You never ask a group a closed question. If I say like, do you like Mexican food? Well, all that you've got there is yes or no as an answer. It's not really that interesting a question. Questions that are more open yield totally different results, etc., etc. So there's many types of questions, and the questions that are typically asked in democratic or like in referendums, etc., are typically not very well asked questions. The best tangible, the best two examples I think that I've seen that do this interestingly. One is the v-Taiwan example, where the question leads to so many subsequent commenting and votes up and down that you actually end up with some interesting view on what people really think. So that's quite a technologically driven answer. And the other one is my vote, I think, in Australia. The reason that's interesting is because what they're asking is to based on all the information they give you, which of these possible destinations far in the future do you want us to move towards? So what direction do you want us to go? And then it becomes the job of people in government to start helping us go towards those directions. They're asking people, what direction do you want us to go in, broadly speaking, and let's take you there. And I think that's really valuable. And just so I can round out my last point, because your question sent me on so many tangents. I think the question of listening is exactly what all of this is about. And the reason, we're all really bad at listening. I'm terrible at listening. I'm constantly told I'm an awful listener. I'm trying really hard, but it's a difficult thing to improve. But to give myself a break, there's no surprise, because when you're a kid, you sit down and you are forced to listen. So fundamentally, you're not listening in class all those years whilst you're like passively receiving, information, content from a leader. That's your image of a leader as a kid. It's the autocrat at the front of the class. And so fundamentally what happens is, from a very young age, we're there as passive spectators, and our vision of a leader is the person at the front of the class. And there's just so many other ways to lead. And so it's just quite easy to see how we as adults are products of that education system. Where you can have models that are really different. I've seen kids make decisions in groups and truly listen to each other and try and understand each other from a really young age. But these aren't skills that are driven into our culture. These are problems that we're dealing with, but we tend to not deal with the root cause, which is that when you were a kid, listening wasn't actually that valuable a tool in your upbringing.
Okay. So, just to bring it back to your first point, you were saying that the way that we recognize that there's a problem right now is because of Brexit and because of Trump. That's one symptom, let's say.
Yeah. It's a way into the conversation.
Yeah. So, how would you respond to somebody that's excited about either of those two outcomes? Because you're not a fan of them. I'm not a huge fan of either of them. But there are millions of people that did vote in that way. And so is there a sense in which suggesting there's almost this like subtle argument of delegitimizing these outcomes that might even come across as not listening? Like, hey, we voted to leave. We don't like Brussels. We don't like Hillary Clinton. We don't like the status quo. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, so maybe just first of all, I'm not saying that I'm for or against Trump or Brexit. I'm against the process by which the decision is made. If the decision had been Remain, it was still a stupid question. Like that doesn't change. Whether you voted for one or the other, what the question doesn't do is help you consider more deeply what this is about. So if whether you voted Hillary or Trump, if you actually start breaking down the things that matter to you, you're almost for sure going to have answers that come from either camp, and many of your best answers will come from neither camp, which isn't an option on the list. So the question just still doesn't work fundamentally.
Demagogue A or demagogue B.
And that's my problem. Yeah, I mean, just neither is going to have all the solutions to all of my beliefs. So we have a thing in England called Vote for Policy, which is little more than a game. But basically, when it comes to the elections, this site gives you all of the policy decisions, and you vote for them all. And then at the end, it says, well, this is the party that most. So they're all anonymized, the policies that have come from all the various parties. And then at the end it says, on balance, it seems like you would vote green or blue or orange or red, And it might not actually be the party that you typically vote for. But the whole point is to show you that if you break this down, it's not about parties. I equally don't necessarily think we should all be voting on policies. Because that can be quite reductionist. I think there's definitely an argument to say that policies are something for people in government to create, but they should be created in order to get us closer to the direction in which we've chosen to go in the first place, I think. But yeah, I mean, regardless of who gets elected, I still just can't see how this person's gonna like represent my point of view, particularly if they've not asked me for it in the first place. It's like saying I've got the answer before you even I'm the answer to the question before I've even asked you the question.
That's right.
I just can't see how you can get to the right outcome with that.
Well, and it's also our entire political song and dance is very ego driven. It's all about this personality or that personality, or maybe a third personality, but it's not about us as a community. I mean, only indirectly is it about like, what are we here for? What are our values? And they try to play that up, but the marketing you're seeing over and over again is John Smith or Jane Doe. And so
yeah, I mean Trump with the red cap,
right.
And no, it's just like perfect to jump into any biases that people might have. And to play on like particular emotions, of course. The best thing I've seen, I don't know if you've read much about it, but is in Syria. I always forget their name. The Kurdish revolution in northern Syria essentially is a form of extreme direct democracy, sometimes referred to as anarchism. And what they're doing is like, if you can do that there, like. How have we not evolved the versions of democracy that we operate on? And they do it by having extreme local level conversations facilitated, and those link up and scale up to form national views. And that seems really interesting, I think. And they're doing that without technology. So.
And is that also the case? My understanding is that there is a group in northern Syria that is being attacked by the Assad government and is also being attacked by the Turkish government. Is this related at all?
Yeah, I think that is the same group we're talking about. Although I'll admit not having read much updated stuff recently, because I think there's been a lot of changes with US troops leaving and various bits. But fundamentally, what they had created, certainly for a while, from what I can gather, is some hyper local versions of democracy. With therefore hyperlocal solutions, and then I think they're called commune levels. They start linking up and like aligning decisions so that you don't just have many very different versions of a government at local levels, but they actually start to align and like consolidate decisions across geographical areas. And I think that's 4 million people. I could be totally wrong on that, but I think that's what I heard. But I think that offers like some of the principles of the stuff I'm talking about are in that. There's real dialogue amongst people in person. It's constantly evolving, and it's happening on an emergent basis rather than a top-down one. And perhaps most importantly, you're not buying into personality, branding, marketing, all of the elements that are easily tricking you when you're voting normally. If I ask my grandma about her policies, about her beliefs, she says all sorts of incredibly wise and nuanced things, and then the moment I ask her who she's voting for, she'll say that she's voting for the same party she's always voted for. And that's the problem that we need to get away from, and I can't see how party-based stuff is going to solve that, because fundamentally you're buying brands and personalities over actually understanding your own decisions and own beliefs in that.
Yeah, that's a really memorable way to look at it. Again, your grandmother.
Well, in this case, it's not just because she's old. It's because her contradictions are so clear. She's incredibly wise and nuanced, but then just she's stuck in her ways in other ways. So she'll always vote for the same people.
Okay, so I want to shift the conversation because you have all this unique work of democracy in the office, right? Democracy in private companies. And so what does that look like? Because it's not an environment that has this legacy of parties, so to speak, right? And so on the other hand, most companies are run extremely hierarchically, extremely top down. There's a whole reporting structure, and at the end of the day, there's one person that's in charge that can ultimately get people kicked out or not. And so let's start with, why would a company want to bring more democracy into their culture?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this maybe goes back to the first question you asked me at the beginning as to like the entry point into this stuff. And I feel like, because I have this with companies a lot of the time, there's basically an effectiveness entry point, which is the argument you reflected back at the beginning around a system being too stupid to govern another system fundamentally. So there's an effectiveness question, and with companies, what's happening there is that typically they're not innovating fast enough, changing fast enough, but the world around them is changing insanely quickly, and so there's just a constant fear of being one of the dinosaurs. So that's one argument as to why. But the second argument is human. Now you can argue it from other reasons. You can still argue it as an effectiveness question, which is that if you have loads of staff who fucking hate their jobs, they're unlikely to be much good at it. But if you can have fully engaged workplaces, then that's going to be wonderful for your output. I think it's 13% of people, this is a Gallup study, are actively engaged at work. Wow. 13.
9 out of 10 people hate
60%. It's insane. Yeah. So 60% are disengaged, which I brand as like indifferent. There's like apathy there. And then 27% are actively disengaged. So they just really hate their job. And so like that's not great. If you want to think of it in terms of time, 13% of time is useful, the rest isn't. Or in terms of money spent on salary, 13% of time is useful, the rest isn't. So there's a huge effectiveness case to make from a company perspective. And then from a customer's point of view, you want, as a customer, the person I speak to from a company, I want them to be empowered to make decisions to help me. I don't want them to have to go up slow hierarchies where you eventually speak to someone who knows nothing about the case that decides for you, and it takes ages. You want many people close to the customer with lots of information to make those decisions. So there's plenty of effectiveness cases. But then I can't just help come back to a almost humanitarian perspective, which is this idea that you live in a democracy, which I'm like strongly. I can't get to a definition of democracy that I think we actually live in on the basis that voting every 5 years is like not great as a sort of baseline for what democracy is as a criteria.
But we aspire to live in a democracy.
Right. So if we
just like North Korea.
Exactly. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Perhaps.
I mean, Democratic People's Republic.
If you claim to, or if you aspire to live in a democracy, what does that really mean? So I'm starting to develop this idea of like full stack democracy. So the most meta level is probably a government. You could argue it's a world government, but let's just stick at a government. And for that to be a democracy, it needs to ask people what it wants, and it needs to move further in that direction. But at the moment, you don't ask them what they want, you ask them who they want, which is a very different question. So you still know nothing about what they want, which is absurd because companies like Facebook and Google know exactly what you want and will manipulate that to the nth degree for profit. And yet with our technology, we've not actually bothered checking that. So that's the most abstract level. But the one that just under is probably companies, is probably organizations. And that's to say that you spend, most people spend most of their lives at work. But at work, do you truly have freedom of expression? Like, are you truly allowed to say, I want this? Or can you, there's plenty of examples, I'm sure, of people losing their jobs for wanting this or that. Do you get to have some sort of say in when and where and how much and all these things? These are all dictated to you. So there's a pretty easy argument to make that you're not free at work, really. I'm not saying for everyone. Many of us are incredibly lucky for that to not be the case. And there's a whole movement of companies that are run truly democratically, and I think they inspire a lot. And then even within this company level, there's many levels. There's organizations. The cooperative platform movement is really interesting. Examples of an Uber type app, but where the platform is owned by the drivers, is a very different version from the one where you extract as much cash as possible and send it to shareholders who haven't done any work and haven't been training the robots to replace them, just like the drivers are doing. So companies are then one example, and then if you keep going down, there's schools, which is the case that you were brought up in a perfect simulation of autocracy. You didn't get to, if I think of in England, a kid is told what to wear. They have a uniform when they go to school. You're told where to sit. You're told when to speak. You're told you can't speak. You're even told when to pee. Like, you have to ask permission to pee. This is like so far away from any definition of democracy. So how could you possibly grow up in that and then as an adult become really skilled in group conversation, which is fundamentally what, one of the best tools of a functioning democracy is great dialogue. You're definitely not going to be skilled in that. You're probably not going to be skilled in knowing what you want because you were never asked what you want. So it's just not a question you've had to answer many times in the past anyway. And yet, I've now been to democratic schools and seen that they function incredibly well, and you have children who grow to be incredibly autonomous as well as compassionate towards one another. And I've now lost the thread of your original question, but just this idea that democracy isn't just a vote that happens for someone. It really goes top to bottom, and companies is one of the layers that happens in. But fundamentally where I'm shifting towards is seeing democracy as a far more holistic thing, schools, companies, and countries.
I hear you talking, first and foremost, you're talking about effectiveness, efficiency, it's going to be better for the bottom line, the customers are going to be happier. And then I hear you making this other argument about the dignity of the participants. You're saying our culture recognizes you as a full participant, not as a, slave being told, go here, do this, do that. And the dignity part, I think, is pretty easy to buy into. The effectiveness part is a little bit. Have you seen that firsthand? I mean, you're the one doing this firsthand. Do you see the transformative effects of bringing these processes and bringing these new values into a company do transform their financial metrics?
I mean, I can't say that I've seen any studies that validate that. Well, at least the studies that I've seen that do validate that are biased in the first place because they're created by people who believe in that being the solution. So I'd be hesitant to put a final result on that. Well, the things you hear said most, let's say, about self-managed companies is that they're far less volatile. That's one thing you hear, which I put down to not having a single point of failure. And I put down to the fact that because it now has emergent properties, many experiments can be going along at the same time, which leads to a system that's far less volatile. Whereas a top-down system is bound to be volatile because there's some sort of like central power thing going on. So that's the main one that you hear: longevity and volatility being improved. But I can't say that I've heard a specific example where like. But also, it's also important to say the incentive structure changes totally as well. Particularly if I go to the full extent of what a democratic company means, which is probably that its ownership model is also democratic to some degree. Your incentive is no longer. Well, first of all, if you're working in a company, the incentive is for the shareholders to get rich quick. If you are now a democratic participant in a company, it changes quite a lot, really, because you start to think about the whole a lot more. You start to think about having far less dips, so you're probably not thinking about things quarterly, but you start to be able to think about things in the long term. You're likely to want to hang out a lot longer in a place. So the incentives financially really change from a quarter by quarter answering to the shareholders to a like is the overall worth and benefit for us financially as a group of people that run this place, is that going up, is that worthwhile? So the effectiveness or the motivation from an effectiveness point of view changes dramatically as well, you know. As an example, I know one place where recently they felt like they were doing pretty well financially. This is a co-owned place, an employee-owned place. So they're just trying to see if they can earn the same money working less now. That's an incentive that a shareholder would never have.
Yeah, that's right. So do you think this applies, that any company could be improved in this way? Like, you know, let's take the example of Apple. I believe Apple is still the largest, by market cap, the largest publicly traded company in the world. At one point, famously, it was, you know, ruled by this autocrat Steve Jobs. And at the same time, it produces, you know, magic. It sells magic over and over and over again. Would you take the position that a company of that scale has the opportunity to transition to a more democratically managed organization?
I mean, I just think that might just be so hypothetical, because it's owned by shareholders. Yeah. So so that they don't, you know, to those in power, equality feels like oppression. It's not really in their interest to change that. So I just can't see that ever being the case. It leads to a question as to whether I definitely see that small groups that start democratically can scale into larger democracies, and I see less evidence of big companies that say in the 100,000 odd transitioning to democracy. There's some reasonably successful examples, but not so many. And so for me, it becomes about, when I'm working with a big organization, the things I start to ask myself is there a local level? Just like I was explaining for countries later, you should go down to the local level. So can there be small teams that run democratically? The answer is definitely yes. So I helped many teams to move towards having constitutions that govern them as teams. And what that typically took is a manager to say, actually, I'd like this to be run by all of us. And they'll create constitutions for their small group of people and they update that constitution every other week to improve the way they work with each other. So you start to see it happen on that level, and therefore the average of the company is overall more democratic, and certainly from a participant's perspective, you now have a say in your day-to-day more than you did at first. But as for an overhaul for the whole company, I mean, you end up with an irony that you have an autocratic decision to become democratic, which is very rare, really.
So, what can the individual what can the individual do, right? So how many people out there are really asking these more like fundamental systemic questions about what does democracy mean? What does healthier democracy look like? What do you encourage the people in your life and your audience to do to proactively move the ball forward?
Yeah, this is a wonderful question, because you fundamentally want to live your life thinking of the biggest thing that you care about, and then thinking of the smallest, or the smallest way the biggest way that you can apply that. So the biggest amount of influence you have, you want to try and do something about it, right? And so this question around democracy in general, the biggest version of something is something, like the system of a country, how a country's governance model works, is something that feels so far out of reach for almost all of us. So the question becomes, if that's your like circle of concern, what's your circle of influence when it comes to that topic? And I think there's a few different levels. I'm less and less, I'd say something that's changed for me personally is that I'm less and less, despite Democracy Squared, I'm actually less and less interested in talking about the big structural change to how a country is run, and more interested in our day-to-day conversations and how they can change. And so I think these layers that I described before of country, company, education, down to family become really interesting. So I can give examples of how I run that on a constant basis. At work, the main thing becomes to start learning about facilitation, I'd say, or at least at the team level. Because most of us can influence the team level, I'd say, in our day-to-day lives. So facilitation for me is a skill that we should all be learning, the ability to help a group to decide without inserting opinion. The facilitator's there to guide the process of decision-making, not to input into the content of the decision. And that's something I think we can all learn about, and there's plenty of organizational models to help us at the team level as well. And then I think really interestingly, there's something about community, really learning to host good dialogue with one another, in the local cafe or whatever, but to have conversations with people where we genuinely listen to each other. So you hear this whole movement at the moment, they call it the intellectual dark web, but this idea that rather than straw manning each other's opinions in order to win, we need to learn to steel man, to like fully understand and hear the other person's opinion, to help them feel heard as well. This comes from Nonviolent Communication by Marshall Rosenberg. This idea of fully hearing another human's needs is something that we're terrible at, and we can learn to do that in all of our relationships. And that is a form of democracy, to learn to truly hear your partner at home and understand what they're needing in a conversation is certainly something I have a long way to go before being good at. So I think that's important. And then at the family level, just to give you a tiny example, we're three, so it's me, my wife, and our son, who's 8. We have a family constitution, and it's hard, but we have like decisions around. It's like documented on the fridge, and we have decisions around like who cooks what nights, and who clears the table, and who sets the table, and how much screen time are you allowed? And we have like constant debate and difficulty around these topics. But overall, I think it leads to a sense that there's one team rather than a clear hierarchy, which of course there is to some degree with children, because there's decisions they're not ready to make, But it leads us down all sorts of rabbit holes. Just to give you an example with screen time, because that's a juicy one. He wants loads of screen time. So we say, well, we're actually not in favor of that because we don't think it's good for you. So he's like, well, isn't it? So we researched it together online, and online we found this study that said an hour a day at his age is a tops. And he was just like, okay, that's really interesting. All right. So he decided on that. But then he said, what about you and your screen time? Because you're on your phones all the time. And like, obviously there's, we're just flawed at that point because he's utterly correct. And so the decision, he proposed a decision for our constitution, which is that we only use our screens in the other room, not in the living space. And so if we need to go and use it, we have to leave the room. We can't be in there, because then we ignore each other in favor of the screen. And so that was a decision that was added onto our family guidelines, and we review it every few weeks. And that's been really valuable. So democracy is something that you really can do like one-to-one or at home in small groups before thinking of changing the whole world. And I really think that if we all lived like that full time, whether it's at home or in companies, then the whole culture around democracy would be very different. And we just wouldn't put up with the way governance on a global level or on a national level is run, because it would just feel so oppressive compared to the way you went to school or the way you were brought up at home or the way you live your personal life. So I think democracy is a cultural shift. Actually, I think we're very far from understanding that.
Yeah, I sort of hear you saying like change happens in your backyard.
Yeah, for sure. I really believe that more and more, or at least change definitely happens in your backyard. It also needs to happen on a far bigger scale. So I'm not shying away from the fact that I think a country that gets to vote on basically which team you're voting for every 5 years, that is an absurd definition of democracy, and that needs changing. But we can all change the backyard now, and over time we need to change the whole thing too. But taking control over what you can take control over is something that we kind of all have to do, I think, if you believe in it.
Okay, so shifting the conversation again, you wrote in your book about the media, and that the media and politicians in the political arena are tightly woven, and that they're really the same industry. So can you expand on that a little bit more? What do you mean about this?
Yeah, as you asked that, I'm wondering if I've changed my opinion at all. I know at the time certainly what I was the main thing that I see and that we see quite often is in the mainstream media. A Guardian reader reads The Guardian, and a Times reader reads The Times, and rarely do we read the other perspective. And of course this plays tightly into our confirmation bias, and we've since found out that filter bubbles online make that even worse. But fundamentally, what I was sharing at the time is that paper is trying to convince you to follow that paper's ideology. So it has a left-leaning ideology or a right-leaning ideology, and you pay them with cash because there's a clear profit incentive to be the confirmation bias has a profit motive behind it as well in a lot of situations. Certainly for Facebook, the decision to have algorithmic filter bubbles is a profit motivated one. You spend more time on site, you get more ads, you give more data, and so the cycle continues. And I see that being more or less the same for a political party, that the motivation is for you to be hearing what you want to hear in order to support that person, which is why you hear beautiful examples of politicians saying two totally contradictory things to two totally different audiences in order to sort of grow the attention that they get from that audience. So I think that was the initial point I was making there. I'm wondering if I still fully believe in that. I think maybe my focus is just shifted from being angry at those sorts of problems to seeking new kinds of solutions, which again we can do individually by seeking all sorts of different information and trying to be better critical thinkers. As well as I think changing the profit incentive behind journalism will also be really, really vital to this. There's no doubt that journalism is at its most important perhaps right now, and we need good journalism, and good journalism needs to have some sort of nuance in there. So yeah, a bit of a ramble, but essentially, I just at the moment I want to place more and more importance on diversity of opinion, diversity of participation as well. I think it's really key that whether all sorts of organizations, but particularly when it comes to media and politics, that diversity be an effectiveness ingredient, because diverse systems tend to be less volatile and more resilient, particularly to ideological manipulation. So, if you have a group of white straight men, then the outcomes, the possible outcomes are probably quite narrow. But if you have a diverse group in the room, then suddenly there's room for lots of different opinions, and that is definitely an ingredient that I feel we need more of in both the political and media landscapes.
Yeah, I think my intuition on this question is that there was this era of mass media, and just in the last 10, 20 years, there's been this absolute explosion in the number of media sources, whether we're talking about millions of individual Twitter feeds or personal blogs or what have you. There's so many more independent journalists and people documenting their world and commenting on their world. And so I'm not sure if the business model has caught up whatsoever. I mean, I think it's hard to do sustainable work on that. But the number of sources seems to have rapidly expanded by orders of magnitude. I mean, certain local newspapers are shutting down, and that's unfortunate. But the total number of sources out there is just exploding between everyone on Facebook, everyone on Instagram, everyone on Twitter. And so my intuition is that is sort of like an upstream change that is a leading indicator of how we'll see politics change as well. That as we have this decentralization and narratives, we'll also start to see, I hope, more decentralization in political leadership. Now, the caveat to that, sort of like you're identifying, are these massive platforms with their algorithms that are reinforcing these filter bubbles. And so it's not totally clear how that plays out. I mean, yeah, so my Twitter feed is going to look very different than your feed, or your news feed is going to look very different from my news feed. It's not clear to me that Facebook's goal or Google's goal with the YouTube recommendation algorithm or what have you is necessarily to drive people more to the left or more to the right. There's a lot of people drawing these conspiracy theories about that, but I don't personally see that much evidence. I mean, it seems like it's happening in every direction.
I think it's just money, isn't it?
Yeah, it certainly seems that way.
Ads and data.
It certainly seems that way. I mean, I think the concern is about censorship, which when these platforms are, can control 90% of the market share, that's a good question to be asking. But it seems like the censorship has a lot more to do with this person is a legal liability and this person is is causing our advertisers to want to pull out, less than I just simply don't like what this person is saying.
Yeah, I mean, you have this, what's it called, a power law dynamic,
Yeah.
This idea that the more views something has, the more views something has, and we've got limited amounts of time, so there's only so many things that can get so many views, and typically it's the most extreme things that amplify the most. So I do think we need some sort of balancing systems. I guess I'm starting to think that platforms like Facebook have such an impact, and YouTube have such an impact, that we need, I think there's a public concern there, and so we're starting to need some sort of, I don't know if participatory design is the way in, or if there's some sort of I'm starting to feel a need for almost committees to have some sort of say, some sort of democratic institution that has a say in how the newsfeed works. But I certainly feel it's starting to be that way. If money is the reason why you see the things that you see, that just seems like a disaster for me. And I feel like this I used to be so inspired by this idea that we could all I self-publish my books, so just the idea that everyone could self-publish is just such an incredible thing. But then when Facebook decides, who they amplify and who they don't. And when I say they decide, I know it's the algorithm, but like there's only so many times you can shake responsibility by saying it's the algorithm that's deciding. I really feel like there is a public interest for those like self-amplifying phenomena to be kind of not decided democratically, but I think there needs to be some representation by people deciding like how we work this, you know. And it could just be that I've suggested a few methods. I think design is an interesting place to start thinking about democracy, the design of platforms, that is. So I think we were doing this a bit with My Vote, but there's just this idea is that you can start your governance model as to how the platform is designed can include, transparency and diversity are two things that can start to up the degree to which you're checking your platform will be in the public's interest. And then the second one is, I think, starting to use behavioral science in order to counter manipulation could be quite interesting. So we have all these examples of biases being exploited through platforms like Facebook and Instagram or whatever, but we rarely look at how we can use nudging to help each other. One example could be that, but if you were going to vote through some sort of liquid democracy platform or whatever in the future, you could add design features such as primers, priming techniques before the vote in order to help you overcome your confirmation bias. So to help you start to consider different opinions before the vote happens, you know? So yeah, anyway, I think design is an interesting area to start thinking about democracy a lot more, particularly when you think of these massive platforms, you know? But it comes down to the profit motive for me on them. Well, so actually, I wanted to have a brief conversation about about liquid democracy. Or at least I'd prepared to talk about that because I just prepared to talk about that as it's a topic that I'm like not fully, I'm not clear on. So the way I'll put it, maybe this is a good way to wrap this up, is that my sense is that I really value the term liquid democracy as a metaphor for something that is constantly changing forever. Like that would be why I'm interested in that term. So as a broad philosophical inquiry, I feel it's really interesting. But then I've said some people use the term as a genuine like nuts and bolts arrival point. It's a bit like Agile was never a methodology, it was a manifesto with some broad principles to follow, but it became a methodology, so it became a dogma. So the moment the verb becomes a noun or something, or the adjective becomes a noun, it becomes static, and therefore it's now an irony in that sense. And so with liquid democracy, my sense is that it should be an adjective, but when it's a noun, it's dangerous. And the main part that I've heard that I think is quite dangerous is this idea of swapping votes, which comes up in a few different implementations of this. So I'm just curious as to your views on what liquid democracy is.
Yeah.
If it's a set of principles or practices kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a fascinating way to tee up the question. I'm probably more on the guilty side of the way you laid it out, of formalizing and putting down a hard definition. So I agree with you in principle, without a doubt, that to me democracy as a larger picture is this constantly evolving thing. Abraham Lincoln has this great work about the unfinished work of democracy, and that's how I think about it. To me, I hear liquid democracy, and I'm not even sure if it's the right term for this concept, but the thing that captured my imagination was the specific idea that every last person, by right in a real democracy, ought to be able to weigh in directly themselves on questions that face the community. Up, down, just like elected legislator is right now. And at the same time, policy is really complicated. There are way too many questions for any one person to have a grasp on it. We live increasingly busy lives, and our world is getting increasingly complicated. And so representation is an incredibly valuable thing. And so liquid democracy says not only can you always weigh in directly, but you have pre-assigned backup representatives, personal representatives, which can be your existing legislator if you want, or it can be a different politician that you trust more, you find more authentic, or it can be someone that's not traditionally associated with the political arena, like a journalist or author or famous academic or professor, or it can be someone close to you in your life, like a family member. You know, it could be the person you would leave your keys with when you're going out of town to water your plants. And so the point is that it's this attempt to get at much higher fidelity representation, where your personal participation, to the extent you can be directly involved, that's a great thing. And all the times you can't be directly involved on one question, you have already said ahead of time, these are the people that I want to be representing my personal vote. And so they actually get my voting power. Or however they vote, I will automatically adopt their position by proxy. And it will be clearly shown that it is by proxy. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think what you're saying is that I think you're saying both. So I was saying I think liquid is an interesting, like, broad philosophical direction rather than a set of practices. And I think what you're saying is that you agree with that, but you do have a you think that that particular example I gave of proxy voting, you think that there's a lot of interesting inquiry to be put into that specific application of the philosophy I'm talking about. Is that right?
Well, the powerful part of it is that it just creates choice. It's all about giving individuals as much choice as possible. And so to the extent that you're of the Constitution that you need to weigh in directly on every last issue, a liquid democratic system gives you that right. To the extent that you want exactly what you get right now, you want to keep your exact same representative, a liquid democratic system gives you that right. And it's really a spectrum of everything in between as well. So those are the two extremes between rule by the people and rule by experts.
And you can change, right? You can pull your proxy.
Exactly. It's always your vote. It's always your voice. You're always in control. And just give people the flexibility. And you can even break it down to be more specific. So you can say, on matters of foreign policy, this is who I think, or these group of people are who I think are really experts. On matters of education policy, the foreign policy people aren't really knowledgeable about that subject. It's not their area of interest. There are these other people who are much more knowledgeable.
Yeah, so I definitely see a lot of promise in that concept. I have a slight, I don't know if fear is quite the word, but I think the details start to matter when it becomes an economy, particularly when it's linked to genuine currencies on the blockchain. I think the degree to which the maths of it start to matter, and if it starts incentivizing people towards certain behaviors rather than others, I think it becomes dangerous. But again, it's something to be split tested, is I guess what I'm fundamentally saying. I definitely think it could be really interesting.
Well, applying it for blockchain governance is very interesting. And if you're familiar with the Tezos blockchain, they use this sort of delegative model and their intention is to use it for internal blockchain governance. I personally and our team are actually much more interested in using it in government. And so an increasing number of us are actually running for office in traditional legislative positions, saying we're going to, if we get elected, it's not about us at all. We're getting elected to champion what we believe is this more accountable, more inclusive, more adaptive and responsive democratic model. And so our pledge as a candidate is that in office, we will vote on policy according to our local liquid majority. And so it's sort of like a one seat, as you put, split test. It's a little one seat split test. Every other seat stays exactly the same, but this particular seat gets to adopt this more what we believe more accountable model, more representative model.
There's this.
And so because of that
this
pledge, it is very important to get the specific details kind of ironed out.
Yeah. Well, because so for me, there's this end goal. Well, let's say where we currently are is there's a person elected and they decide.
That's right. They're local little thief lord. They're the local governor of 1 million people.
And then in the future, what I think we're both talking about is we want to get to a future where all the people there, let's go like full utopia, where all the people there who want to decide. And then in between, we have the journey to take us there. And it strikes me that what we're talking about is a journey towards increased distribution. So if I use this metaphor for a second, that a server system, if it has a central single point of failure, then it's fragile. But if it is a distributed server system, then it's more resilient. But that is untrue to an extent, because if all of the systems in that distributed system are the same, if I hack one, I can hack them all. Because it's the same key to all the doors, right? And what happens, I think, the fear for me is that as we move towards if we manage to move to this increasingly distributed system that you and I are starting to talk about here, in between you have a situation where some people are starting to weigh in on your decision. So you've been elected, your pledge is that you'll ask the people on every topic, and 100 people answer. Those 100 people might all be from one ideology. They might all be
heavily biased.
They might all be left-leaning. Yeah. Exactly. And so what we lack there is diversity, which is that second principle, that if a server system is distributed and all the hardware and all the software in the server system is different, a hacker won't be able to hack the whole system. He won't be able to compromise the whole system in one go because of that resilience. And so what we need, I think, and I'm unsure how to do that, is let's say 100 people weigh in on your decision that you're pledging to follow in your elected position. How do we ensure that 100 people is representative in of itself, that it represents all the different communities and even you get down to neurodiversity. How do you make sure introverts and extroverts are in there, young people and old, black and white? So not just demographic, but also perhaps neurological or cultural or socioeconomic, whatever. And that's a question I've not answered yet.
Certainly.
Because we're in that in-between phase.
Yeah. Well, again, I mean, the first premise is, again, start with what we have right now. Right now we have one single decision maker. At the end of the day, they're making all the up-down decisions. And so right now we have this extreme singleton for that position, right? And so I think what you're suggesting is that the 100 people that are weighing in might have the appearance of being more community involvement, but in fact, they actually aren't diverse at all, and they're practically equal in their ideology, just like that one single person, if they had just gotten elected, would have been, right? So then the next, so without it, I guess I'm just trying to set it out as saying that our current system of 500 Congress people on behalf of 300 million doesn't include a lot of diversity. Now no,
agreed, because so I think the argument you're making is that it's you can't get much worse than one person from one filter bubble making all decisions.
But with a caveat, because they do claim to say, "Oh, I'm listening to all these constituencies." I mean, they say implicitly, reach out to me, contact me, I want to hear from you.
Yeah.
The problem that I personally...
Well, there's an incentive on their side, which is that they want to get re-elected.
Right.
And that forces some degree of at least perceived representation. But again, it's debatable as to how true that is and how much it smokes and mirrors.
And we call this a liquid candidate, the person that ran for office to represent the liquid system. The liquid candidate also wants to be re-elected in theory. Right. I think the difference, the issue that I take with the feedback, the way in which the community tries to make their voices heard on current issues, is that the entire process is incredibly opaque. The representative says, call me, call my office, write me a letter, send me an email, but nobody can see that. And so when I have felt very strongly about particular issues and wanted to reach out, I'll do it and I won't get any response. It feels like my message is going into a black hole.
Yeah, but this goes down to the culture of listening.
Exactly.
We institutionally don't listen.
But I mean, I have some sympathy for these legislators. You know, I've been working on this for a while, and I've gotten to know some of them to different degrees, and just saw the players at stake. And there's just so many people we're talking about here. So my local city representatives have 80,000 constituents each. My state representatives have 500,000 constituents each, and my federal representatives have nearly 1 million. And so it's, you know, just the math, the numbers don't work out. It's absurd to pretend that they can have a one-on-one conversation with every constituent. So in any case, just to get back to it, the first premise is just that we're trying to bring this deliberation, bring all these different perspectives and communities out into the open and make it a much more transparent process so that we can see, you know, where different people fall in this. The other issue is that, the other point to keep in mind is that because of the nature of the proxying, it's not like we're asking every single last person to devote a massive amount of time to getting on board. We've set up a system already. So we've been building all the technology to make this easy and free and everything. And we've already set up a system where you can simply send a text message. You write the word liquid, space, and then a custom username to one text message, to one phone number, and it writes back to you, thanks for getting started with Liquid. Click here to verify your identity to prove you're an actual registered voter. And after you go through those steps, you have assigned that person as your personal representative, as one of your proxies. And so what that means is, if we have this system, this hypothetical problem like you're describing, where there's 100 people dominating and the other 99% of the community is left out, there's a very clear incentive and there's a very clear path for leaders in that 99% to go around and say, hey, you know, our representative is totally failing us, is totally falling down. Will you take the 60 seconds to let me represent you on these issues and rebalance that number out?
Yeah, I guess what's important then is that becomes an active like a strategy or practice, let's say, an active practice, that we seek diversity. So I feel like I feel what's interesting about this is I think it's probably quite easily measured. That like if you think of an X and Y axes, one of them being distribution, so literally quantity of people who are weighing in on your decision. Yep. By diversity, so like that will be like you need some sort of set of coefficients or something to create that. But essentially, how different are people in this group? And you can seek that diversity. Seeking distribution is perhaps more of a straightforward. It's like eyeballs and clicks. That seeking diversity is a second measure to have, but it's totally possible to seek that measure, and it's possible to know how well you're doing on it, and it's possible to be totally transparent about it. And for me, that's probably fractal as well. It means the organization that starts, so this is the legislator and their team, probably needs to be diverse in the first place. Then there's extra approaches. So for instance, with my vote, we were talking at one point about when we share. If you have a voiceover, or so for instance, to give my vote, just not so much my vote, but the approach that I was working on with them at one point was that when you share information about a policy, not everyone wants to read that much, so you therefore need to have different versions. So you might have an audio and a video version of that information because more people might be likely to read. Then the audio version, if it's like a white English guy with a posh voice, then you're going to appeal to certain type of people very naturally, and probably going to annoy a load of other people very naturally. So then you need to have the system running in such a way that it's randomizing the voiceover that you're getting, and there's a variety of different voiceovers that you get for that information. You know, so you might have the white stripe guy reading your video, but someone else got someone totally different reading theirs, etc., etc. And then there's where you reach that information out to. So you need to actively think of all the bubbles that you're not a part of or that exist, and you need to go and try and burst each one, and actively seek diversity in that sense. And in that sense, I think this is probably quite straightforward, actually, but it just is something that needs to be measured. And the thing I think I'm in favor of, you were talking a lot about transparency, I'm in favor of us measuring the degree to which we are achieving difference, and transparently documenting that. So you know, it might be that you're open about how diverse your team is, but also your listenership, etc., etc. So what you need to come back and try and prove to people is, I'm getting loads of different viewpoints here. I'm not getting 100 people from one camp. And if you do that transparently, hopefully you're accountable to that diversity ratio increasing and increasing over time, you know? So I think it needs to be a set KPI in a way for that team. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally.
Muddied things? Or?
No, it makes perfect sense. It's I love it. A lot of people bring up this concern that you're raising. I don't think any of them have proposed a really solid solution, and I think you have.
So it could be, for instance, that you have as simple as this: when you on your system, when there's the number of people who weighed in on a pledge, maybe there's also like the this is a bit corny, but maybe there's also like the rainbow coefficient. You know, if it's a 1 on 10, it means this is an absolutely non-representative diversity achievement, and if it's a 10 on 10, it means like really like lots of very, very different people have weighed in on this. And distribution times diversity for me is what representation will more or less be about.
So just to really try to suss out the details, because obviously you've thought about this a lot, what are the particular like parameters? What are the particular, I think you used the word coefficients, but by what sort of factors would you personally be interested in measuring diversity? So we could talk about, I mean, the easy one is age, registered political party, geography. We don't have data right now about socioeconomic level, but the data's out there.
Yeah, you can get quite academic on this. I think there's it's for me going to work in levels of, I'm sure there's some shortcuts, but for me it's going to work broadly in most abstract to most specific levels of data. So male, female, or non-binary being one. It's important to be incredibly, like, I in my like brief research into this, it's important to be incredibly updated on how to measure diversity when you come to demographics and gender and race and ethnicity. That in itself is an education I've found I'm constantly stumbling on, and that's okay. I'm like trying to not fall prey to political correctness on it all the time. But that becomes one way. Then you start getting, like you say, into the real nitty gritty. I'm sure there's some academics who know some shortcuts into knowing some stuff about people. I wouldn't be surprised if you had some mad piece of study that said, like, you know, people who buy kale vote Democrat and people who buy steak vote Republican, or like, you know, whatever. And therefore, can you get the data on kale and steak eaters on your I don't know, but I'm sure there's some method.
There was an algorithm that, based on your make, year, and color of your car, can predict how you would vote with 87% accuracy.
Right. Okay. So that stuff exists. So yeah, I'm sure there's lots of different levels. I've been thinking about it without all of that knowledge, and my basic one has been like, on all the demographic ones possible, can I go there? So like race, ethnicity, gender, biological sex, education, socioeconomic, etc., etc. The ones you can probably expect. Then the next level starts to go. Somehow, I don't know if ideology is the right way to think about this, but perhaps it's useful. I don't know the degree to which left and right are useful, but it might be something on a values basis. When we stereotype the political binaries, we tend to stereotype them in terms of how much do you think of yourself or others, how much do you think of the past or the future, and I'm sure there's all sorts of ways to cut that. To find out who is a future versus a past thinker. I'm sure there's always to do it. You could even get it down to personality tests to the degree that I don't know then I start to think like, why not include star signs whilst you're at it? Yeah. So I'm never quite sure. But what I think is probably the more variables in there, the better. You've got to start somewhere. So maybe demographics is a simple place to start. But then you need to start like just adding more and more variables into this mix, and then you start to have a conversation about how you're attributing different weights against different variables, and this is why this conversation itself needs to be transparent. So that calculation of diversity, my gut feeling is that needs to be transparent so that we can be poked at. And so that people can say, wait a minute, you're not thinking of this, you're not thinking of that, and we can keep improving. However, there's an argument to say that if it's transparent to hacking as well. And so someone knows that if they just get loads of kale eaters to vote on this policy, then they're going to get their way, and that's going to be great. I'm sure there's fringe examples where that's possible, but we're pretty far off that, I'd say.
Yeah, I think the concern I'd have is all of this data self-reported, because if we're just asking people, do you prefer kale versus steak?
Yes, agreed. Well, so that's why you need to find out, like, yes, exactly. And I don't know what are the measurable ways that aren't invasive of finding out that stuff. I totally agree. Yeah. Like, how can you find out that someone buys kale without asking them and without having their bank statements?
That's right.
I want neither of those extremes. So yeah, I don't know. Good luck on that, mate.
Well, the interesting thing is it's there's a certain similarity to Cambridge Analytica psychographic profiling, but for the exact opposite prerogative. Yeah. It's can we identify as much information about these people, but not in order to change their mind, but so that we can
simply know what they want. Yeah, and it's the same. That constant thing of the technology in itself isn't bad, which is I think like an interesting debate in of itself. But you have that with the biases question. So far, I've only seen biases. I've seen knowledge of biases used to mainly manipulate and addict people or get them to buy shit they don't need. Or vote for people they don't know anything about. Exactly. Or I've seen it, you see it in the corporate world, like maybe this is slightly less harmful to make better decisions. But I see understanding biases as a form of personal development. Like knowing that my confirmation bias is like this, is extreme, for instance, like that definitely makes me a worse person. Like it definitely means I listen to other perspectives less. It means that I'm probably more divisive in relationships. It means all sorts of things. So you start to think, well, how can I use this knowledge of biases for good and do so ethically? So nudging people towards political decisions doesn't feel right, but nudging people to counter certain biases for me feels potentially useful. Certainly if it's done transparently so that we can have a debate about whether this is right or wrong. So that's why there's this famous HSBC advert, so the bank, where they have the back of a shaved head, right? And it has 3 pictures of the same shaved head replicated 3 times. And on one it says style, on one it says soldier, and on one it says survivor. And you just have this like, whoa, it's a really powerful image, and you're like, fuck, okay, I just totally projected onto the shaved head. I meditate a lot, so I saw a monk, and I ran a test recently. I showed that shaved head at a conference, at a tech thing, And they said, oh, it's Jeff Bezos.
Yeah.
But of course, because they've come in through the lens that they're into technology. So what I was thinking is, before you go and make your decision, rather than being triggered by the last thing you saw in your social feed that's created by the confirmation bias, can you be given the shaved head as well as a load of other things that's just sufficient to make you reconsider that there's a different perspective on the topic that you're about to vote on?
Yeah.
Another one is mindfulness as a tool is amazing for helping you sort of put your prefrontal cortex into action and not be so reactive to the limbic system. So is there a way that there are apps now, like mindfulness apps, where when you follow your thumb on the moving bubble for a certain period of time, you find yourself being less reactive. So when your vote is low, pause is the name of that app. So I was thinking, when you go and vote, before the vote, is there just a 10-second or a 5-second loading system where you're following the bubble on the screen, and that's just enough for you neurologically to maybe start to bypass some of your biases? I don't know. But I think there's a way of applying this knowledge to the total contradiction of the way it's currently being done, as per your example with Cambridge Analytica,
Yeah, there was an interesting study about if you put subjects in a room with a bad odor, they would vote for more conservative options.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I wonder, if you're thinking, I know you guys are thinking of a lot of this being screen based, or a lot of the solutions. Is there a sound or a way that doesn't make people vote this or that, but quite the opposite, makes people put their executive functions into gear, and not necessarily fall prey to the last social bias that they got hooked by,
Well, and the other thing is the actual client itself is open source, and it would be great if there was a diversity of different approaches here. So, you have your mindful voter, and you also have your efficient voter, if you will.
Yeah. Totally.
Democracy browsers.
There'll be no end to the ways this can be tested and broken down, right?
Okay, so thank you again, Jon. And where can people find out more about your work? Website, social media, where should people go? Your book?
Yeah, less and less on social media. I'm definitely trying to leave that world. There's too many incentives to make me a bad human being on there. So my website and newsletter are probably the best place. The website's jonbarnes.me. That's JONBARNES.me. /newsletter for that. You can find my books on there. Democracy Squared is probably the one we've mainly spoken about. I've also touched a bit on some of the content from Tech Monopolies, which is about addictive design. And /podcast for other discussions on that as well.
Love it.
Great. Thanks so much, man. This was fun talking.
Yeah, lots of fun.